So, art at the seaside. What is the seaside? A place for holidays it is now, but it wasn't always like that. It started around about the middle of the 18th century, and people visited spa towns before then for medicinal purposes. And then the idea arose that entering the sea was good for medical reasons. And so towns like Scarborough, which was a spa town and on the sea, people would go to the spa town and enter the sea. It became more popular later in the 18th century, 1783, when George III started to take his family to Weymouth. So you might have read that Weymouth was one of the earliest seaside resorts. Now let's get into it a bit further. This is by Thomas Rowlandson, Venus Bathing, from about 1800. And you can see the practice of immersing the body in the sea was fraught with problems of impropriety. Rowlandson is actually making fun not just of the practice of bathing, but also of the voyeurs. If you look at the top of the cliff and on the beach, there's people standing there enjoying the view. And the solution was more control over the bathing experience and the use of bathing machines. And bathing machines became part of the etiquette of bathing because they provided modesty and shelter. Usually there was a person, a dipper they were called, to help dunk you into the sea, and they would, a horse or a donkey would pull the bathing machine into the sea and then pull it out. You had to signal that you wanted to be pulled back to shore. And they were in use for about 100 years. Their use started to wane in about 1890s, and they were left at the top of the beach and used for changing into costumes to go into the sea. And then they sort of turned into beach huts. Beach huts became holiday homes for initially the working class, but in the 1930s, George V started using beach huts and the upper classes followed. And so beach huts became more the preserve of the middle classes. But let's look more closely at this question of propriety. Bathing machines. They hid the bather from public view until they entered the water. Men and women bathed separately, a long way apart. A quarter of a mile was suggested, because men always bathed naked, and women would, not always, but women would wear thick, heavy woolen costumes. But even these caused problems, because you read in the magazines about how the women would lie down in the sea and the waves would cause their costumes to ride up to their necks when they lay in the waves. We don't know whether this was intentional or not. Now, bathing machines had to be hired, of course. You had to pay for them. And so they were used by the middle class women, and working class men and women couldn't afford costumes or bathing machines. And so what they would bathe naked together in the sea. And the questions of propriety were more questions for the middle classes and their concern about respectability. Just to return to men bathing, because it seems strange to us, they bathed naked up till about the 1860s, when there was pressure to start to wear costumes around about that period. But we see in there's a diary of a rector from 1874 where he decries the detestable custom of bathing in drawers. And he wrote, "If ladies don't like to see men naked, why don't they keep away from the sight?" So that was the view of men, that they should be entitled to wear. And in fact, men continued to bathe naked in rivers and so on, and in the sea. But it was becoming more and more unacceptable. But there were other issues as well for women. One of them was hair, because respectable women in the Victorian period were never seen with their hair loose, except by their husbands when they went to bed. And hair was a bit of a fetish in the Victorian period. So what women did, you can see here in the picture on the left, the women have their long hair, which I assume they stayed in the bathing machine to dry it. On the right, the illustration is a bit later. The women are wearing bathing caps to try and keep their hair dry, but they were pushed under the water still. It seemed to be part of the convention of bathing, is that you immersed yourself completely. So that was another issue, how to dry your hair and stay respectable. Incidentally, men could freely look at women bathing, although in a letter to the Times, it said that men with telescopes were brutal. That was the word that was used, but women weren't even allowed to glance at men bathing. They would lose their respectability. Let's have a look a bit more about this men with telescopes thing. This is Margate, Thomas Rowlandson again, Summer Amusement at Margate, or A Peep at the Mermaids, it's called. You might think it's a bit exaggerated. I was going to say it was a bit exaggerated, but having read further about Margate, I'm not sure it was. At Margate, men and women would bathe together in what was called in the press promiscuous bathing. And according to the magazines at that time, men would use telescopes to get a better view of the, and I quote, nude groups and sportive sirens in the water. And it was also reported that these magnifying mediums, as they called telescopes, were as likely to be used by ladies as by gentlemen. And the conclusion in the article was that Margate was not a place which attracted truly modest women. So that's Margate for you. You can see here the women are bathing naked. This woman here is obviously very upset, annoyed that her husband is looking, but it seems that it did take place in certain resorts more than others. Another danger, and this is a sort of a joke here about obstinate donkeys, and it's called News from Worthing. In a letter from a beast of burden to her brother Jack, the illustration is followed by a poem alleged to have been written by the donkey. And it shows a woman stuck in the sea. And in this poem, the donkey makes fun of the people that are riding it and talks about all the pranks the donkeys get up to. You can see here, it's running away. To here, it's sort of bucking and throwing the lady off the donkey. And here, it's just stopped dead in the water, and there's nothing the lady can do. She can't get off because she's in the sea. The donkey won't move. And the donkey said that no amount of people pulling it will get it to move. So the donkey just regards the whole thing as fun and as a joke. And in fact, I think the conclusion of the slides you've just seen is that it was great fun for both sexes. It's the beginning of the seaside as a place to relax and enjoy yourself. But of course, there was a serious side. This is a painting by Turner called Margate, 1822, when he was a well-known artist. And it shows a ship foundering and the locals salvaging goods. It looks like a lee shore, that is, the wind is blowing onto the shore, and large sailing ships couldn't tack, that is, sail into the wind. And there was always a danger of being swept on the shore and unable to escape. So this ship here appears to be breaking up. There's various items of flotsam and jetsam. Flotsam, of course, is the items that float away from the wreck, and jetsam is those that are intentionally thrown overboard to, for example, lighten the ship. The difference is that flotsam is still the owned by the ship owner, and jetsam, things that have been deliberately thrown overboard. If you gain them, take them, you own them. The person who discovers the jetsam owns it. And here there's another, the law around all of this is very complex. Here there's what looks like a salvage operation, and with salvage the owner has to compensate the people who help, the voluntary services, whether the owner asks them to help or not. So these people will claim compensation, and some of them it looks as though they're taking away goods from the ship, whether it's flotsam or jetsam. That also happened, and it looks as though there's a ship in the background here that is being swept onto the shore, and there's a group of people, I don't know what they're doing, waiting for it to founder. Now Turner had a close connection with Margate because he was sent there when he was just 11 to stay with his uncle, who was a fishmonger in the town, and he loved the sea. He did a lot of drawings of Margate, and they were sold in his father's shop. His father had a barber shop near Covent Garden, and he used to sell Turner's pictures. But by the time that was when he was 11, which was 1786, he was 11. But this is years later when he was an established artist. And by 5 years after he painted this, he would be traveling to Margate most Saturdays. He would travel by ship to escape London, and he loved sailing. He came by sea, and he would stay at a guest house in Margate run by Mrs. Sophia Booth, and her husband died, where are we, 22, about 10 years, 11 years after this was painted, and he later adopted the name Booth and lived in her guest house with her as Mr. Booth. Later he changed that to Admiral Booth. People always thought he looked a bit like a sailor because of his windswept face. Another painting by Turner, Hastings, this time fish market on the sands early morning, a couple of years later. Now, what's interesting about this, I think if I enlarge it, you can see here there's two well-dressed women looking for fish to buy, with a boy who has a hoop. There are lobsters and fish laid out. But the strange thing about this, until you understand the context, is this person here and this person here are dressed as Greeks. And this person, of course, has his arm in a sling. So why are there two Greeks on Hastings Beach? Well, it was the middle of the Greek War of Independence. It'd been going on for about 3 years at this point, and it had widespread support in Britain. In fact, Lord Byron had just raised funds for the Greek cause, travelled out there and died of fever in Missolonghi in 1824, the same year this was painted. And so it's a reference to the Greek War, which had widespread support in Britain. As I said, that's why there's two Greek figures on the beach. The other great romantic painter of this period, John Constable, is here painting the other great invention of the seaside, the pier. This is the Chain Pier, Brighton. It was built about, where is this, 1826? It was opened about 3 years before this was painted, so it was new, and it was a great scientific achievement. This cast iron suspension bridge fixed over here to the cliff and fixed down this end to the sea with an enormous chain going along it. So why did they build it? They built it to enable cargo ships to unload and to load at the end of the pier, and also for the cross-channel ferry to Dieppe to safely berth here at the end of the pier. And that meant that people went on to the pier to get onto the ferry. Originally that was free, and it became so popular as a tourist attraction, they started to charge two old pennies to go onto the pier, which was there was something like 4,000 people a day went onto the pier. It was one of the great attractions of Brighton. And there's a story of 30 to 40 people standing at the end of the pier in a raging storm, being thrilled to be soaked to the skin and blown around by the wind. Of course, I think today health and safety would have something to say and would close the pier in such dangerous conditions. But then it was exciting. The railway arrived in 1840. The number of cargo ships diminished because trains could take goods, and the piers became more pleasure piers. And to maintain the income from visitors, to encourage visitors to go onto the pier, they had booths selling food and small entertainment venues which grew in size until 1866, when the West Pier in Brighton was opened, eventually destroyed in a storm, and the third pier at Brighton, the Palace Pier, the one that remains today, opened at the end of the century, 1899, as a major entertainment centre. Switching, coming forward through the century, 1852, this is William Holman Hunt, one of the three founders of the Pre-Raphaelite movement, along with Dante Gabriel Rossetti and John Everett Millais. And this is Strayed Sheep, Our English Coasts. And the first thing to say about it is that William Hunt did read John Ruskin's book, which exhorted young English artists to go to nature in all singleness of heart, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and scorning nothing. Ruskin was a very religious man, as was Holman Hunt, and he was inspired by Ruskin's words to create a number of works of art inspired by religion. Even this one, as we shall see. Now, the painting was first admired by critics. Let me show you one of the things that was pointed out by critics. You can see the sun shining through the ear of this sheep, and he's even representing the blood vessels in the sheep's ear. And that's what we mean by sort of truth to nature. He was observing exactly what happened in nature. And over here, it's a bit difficult to see, but over here, there are two, let me enlarge it. There are two butterflies which he caught down on the coast, killed them, mounted them, took them back to the studio and painted them into the scene that way to ensure that they were represented accurately, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and scorning nothing, true to nature. Now, the title of the painting, that there's two titles. When it was displayed at the Royal Academy, it was in the catalogue as Our English Coasts. And one of the things that people looking at the painting would know that he was making a point about was that there was an enormous concern in this year of the French invading, and concern that our coasts were very poorly defended. And so that's what this is drawing attention to, the beauty of our English coasts and their lack of defence. But it was also known as, had an inscription on the frame, the lost sheep, which had religious significance. And when it was exhibited in France 3 years later, the title was Strayed Sheep. And sheep refers to the pastoral flock, and strayed sheep are those that have lost sight of God. You might think this is straining interpretation, but it's not. This is the way that it would have been seen in the Victorian period. They associated sheep with the pastoral flock, and strayed sheep and sheep in danger here as people who were in danger of not falling off a cliff, but falling into sin. So it's a metaphorical painting. Coming on to a painting that's a less metaphorical and a bit more representation of the typical seaside holiday. And in fact, this is the first representation of seaside holiday in fine art. That is, aside from the engravings you've seen. This is 1851 to 54. It's William Powell Frith, and views of this painting were very mixed. It's a representation of contemporary Victorian life, which was itself unusual, revolutionary, you might say. In fact, you probably remember the Impressionists. One of the things that inspired them was to represent everyday life, inspired by the writings of Charles Baudelaire. But this painting predates the first Impressionist exhibition by some 20 years. Some critics described it as, and this is a quote, a piece of vulgar Cockney business, and another called it a tissue of vulgarity. However, that's what the critics thought, but the public loved it. And in fact, it was one of the first paintings where the Royal Academy had to install a guardrail to keep people back from the painting. And the guardrail became an ultimate sign of success. And in total, over the years, Frith had 6 guardrails in front of his paintings, of a big sign of popular success. Now, it was bought from the Royal Academy exhibition by a Mr. Lloyd, who then sold it immediately to Queen Victoria the same year for £1,000, which was the price he paid for it. But Frith cleverly retained reproduction rights and earned as much as £3,000 from selling prints. Prints of this painting were extremely popular. Now, coming on to the painting, which you've had a chance to look at now, I think one of the reasons Queen Victoria might have bought it is that she stayed in Ramsgate before she became Queen, when she was a young girl, and she stayed in this building here, Albion House, the highest building in this painting. And in fact, it was when she was staying in the house that she nearly died of typhoid. And it was the occasion you might have read about when Sir John Conroy forced a pen into her hand and tried to get her to sign her authority over to him, but she wouldn't. She resisted. Now, Victoria also first entered the sea, but not at Ramsgate. In a few years before, in 1847, was the first time that she had gone into the sea, and she wrote a nice little description in her journal. Drove down to the beach with my maid and went into the bathing machines, where I undressed and bathed in the sea for the first time in my life. A very nice bathing woman attended me. I thought it delightful till I put my head underwater, when I thought I should be stifled. So that's from her journal of 1847. Frith actually took his family to Ramsgate the year before, and he painted people from real life. He would have used models because he's assembled this and painted it as if he was in the sea. He probably made sketches there and painted it in the studio. He's included a self-portrait. It's a bit difficult to find him, but he's this person here. In fact, this person is, I think, what we're inclined to think, looking at the ladies coming out of their bathing machines, which is also indicated over here by this person with a telescope looking in the same direction. And this little person here, I don't actually know whether it's a boy or a girl, looking in the same direction as well. This little girl here paddling in the sea is, we think, his daughter. And you'll notice there's a lot of people reading, protecting themselves from the sun. There's a lot of umbrellas. Oh, and I think there's a lot going on. In fact, this painting was part of when I was at the Courtauld, my tutor there had written in her PhD thesis, she'd written over 40 pages explaining the details of this one painting. She analysed every single person in it, every building, and researched the background to the types of people. I won't go into a lot of the detail now, but just one thing that I find interesting is it's a bit difficult to see perhaps, but see this woman here in white and this man here, these two things here are white mice. And the man puts them on the ground to scamper around to entertain. And then he expects a payment, a penny for the entertainment. But I think the interesting thing is the woman has no fear of the mice. They're just looking with a vague interest, with no sign of discomfort at all. So obviously this thing about scared of mice and standing on chairs was a lot later than the Victorian period, where they're probably quite used to mice scampering around. A couple of years later, and things are starting to change, but not to a great extent. What's happening here is, let me just read it. The young lady is saying, "Can I have a machine now?" And the bathing woman is saying, "Not here, sir. Gentlemen's bathing a little further down." In other words, this cartoon in Punch is making fun of the fashion to dress in a slightly masculinized fashion. But I don't think in 1856 the profound shift in society had yet taken place. For example, the term "new woman" wasn't used until 1894, so some 40 years later. But it does show things are starting to change even as early as the 1850s. Oh, another painting that always sets me thinking, this is in the Tate, William Dyce, Pegwell Bay, Kent, a recollection of October the 5th, 1858. Well, let me just point out what happened on October the 5th, 1858. It was Donati's comet, and you could probably see it, but let me just mark it there. I've marked it in red. That's the comet in the sky. It was recently discovered. It was visible in the daytime. It was the talk of many people. And William Dyce typically painted religious paintings, religious subjects, but he'd taken his family on holiday to Pegwell Bay in the autumn of this year, 1858. And these figures in the foreground are his wife, two sisters, and his son, and they're gathering shells and fossils. Now, one interpretation of this painting is that it's about time, because obviously the fossils invoke geological time, and Donati's comet had been calculated to return every 2,000 years. And then we have the modern day of people who are, well, for me, this painting set at twilight has a sense of calmness about it, profound calmness. And so the other element of time is present day time. And here it's as if time is standing still. Whether he intended that or not, and I mean, another slightly related interpretation is that it's a religious painting of the the God-given scene, the wonders, if you like, the awe of the cliffs and so on. But, and William Dyce is well aware of this, as it much discussed by the middle classes, is an interest in geology. Charles Lyell had published his Principles of Geology in 1830 to 33, and they were much discussed because let me simplify. His conclusion was that the Earth was many millions of years old, whereas most people considered it to be a few thousand years old. And so the discovery of fossils and the significance of fossils, which initially were thought to be a result of the Great Flood, it was realized that they must be, when you read Principles of Geology, that they must be a lot older than that. And this conflicted with the Bible. So this painting is illustrating or highlighting or drawing attention to that conflict that was going on in discussions but in the between middle classes. American realist painter Winslow Homer stayed for 2 years in Calicotes, and he lived through the American Civil War, the abolition of slavery, and he was interested in the issues of the day, relationships between us, race, and so on. But he traveled to Europe, he traveled to France, England, came back through the Bahamas, Cuba, and so on. And when he was in England, he painted scenes of heroism and resilience. Now, the early version of this painting, painted, as I said, at Calicotes, showed a life brigade house, men in foul weather clothes, and a ship. But for some reason, it's not clear why, the critics didn't like it. And so he modified it to this painting, a lone woman and child. And in fact, the coast is based on the coast of Maine. And critics loved it. They were full of praise. And one illustration of why they might not have liked the original is that they said the reason they liked this is because they were weary of other artists' insolent, conceited affectation by men who force themselves full before all those who see their pictures. In other words, they thought a lot of artists, the pictures were contrived, conceited, whereas they thought this one was an honest representation. He wasn't introducing himself into the picture, they felt. He was representing what he saw and allowing you to put your own interpretation on it. Stanhope Forbes in Newlyn, a fish sale on a Cornish coast. And you can see there's a sale going on in the background. There's people in the foreground, I guess, waiting for the auctioneer or jouster, I think it's called, to come over and start selling her fish. Stanhope Forbes, well, he was Irish. He was born in Dublin, but studied in London. and the Royal Academy, at the Royal Academy School. He studied also in Paris, and there he was influenced by the French artist Jules Bastien Lepage, and he visited the art colony in Brittany. And then when he came back to England, he settled in Newlyn in 1884, the year before this was painted. And the paintings that were exhibited at the Royal Academy of Newlyn, like this one, attracted other artists to Newlyn. Now, it was partly they came because of his reputation, and he was very charismatic. Partly they came because it was cheap, and there were things to paint, and they could live more cheaply in Newland. Many of them didn't come because they were trying to represent and improve the lives and conditions of the people there. They talked about Newlyn being a dirty hole, and they complained about the continual smell of rotting fish. And they also complained that the locals would charge them twice as much as they would charge the local fishermen and their families. There was a lot of social activity, so they also came because it was a place where the artists and their families could get together. And just as an example, later Harold and Laura Knight arrived in 1907. I'll talk about Laura Knight in a moment. And when they arrived, they ordered furniture, linen and silver from Harrods, using the Harrods catalogue. So they made the conditions there good conditions for themselves, and didn't really worry too much about the conditions for the fishermen. It was just a subject to paint. This is Laura Knight, but this isn't Newlyn. This was painted before she went. As I said, she went in 1907. This was painted in 1900 at Staithes in Yorkshire, and it was shortly before she married Harold Knight. Her maiden name was Johnson. Now, Staithes was another relatively small artist colony. There are a number around the coasts, and there they made friends with other artists in the colony. And but when she was at art school in Nottingham, she was born in Nottingham and went to the Nottingham School of Art, she went to an exhibition of the Newlyn School artists, which impressed her. And so from Staithes, after they were married, they decided that they would go down to Newlyn to work. And that's where they went, as I said, in 1907. This was one of her, I think, best known paintings at Staithes, one of her more ambitious paintings. She actually signed, well, you can't really see the signature, but she signed it Laura Johnson. It might not look typical Laura Knight, because I've shown Laura Knight pictures before. Her style changed when she went to Newlyn. Her palette lightened. The Newlyn pictures are much lighter, brighter, brushwork is freer. Maybe it was the carefree bohemian lifestyle in Newlyn. And then another artist colony is Walberswick. This is Walberswick Pier, and this is painting by one of the leading avant-garde artists in Britain, Philip Wilson Steer. It looks like a French impressionist or post-impressionist painting, and there's a lot of attention to the surface properties, as you can see. It's a naturalistic representation. It's an everyday life subject. There was some it's influenced perhaps by Whistler and Degas, but his style changed around about 1895, a few years before, and he became influenced by the works of the old masters as they were by then, Constable and Turner, and started to paint the English countryside. But this is one of his seaside paintings. He visited, it was a small artist colony at Walberswick, and this appears to be at first a carefree picture of two girls running down the pier, having fun in Walberswick. But the more you look at it, the more there's a feeling of closeness because of the way, I think it doesn't really come across in the reproduction so well, but of the texture of the painting. There's a feeling perhaps of claustrophobia. There's three people approaching the girls. We can tell because of the three shadows down in the foreground. They are holding hands in the shadow of them, the girl's shadow on the pier. They're holding hands, but they're not holding hands in the paint in here. This is one arm and this is the other arm, but here they're holding hands, which maybe signifies, I don't know, put your own interpretation on it, the end of friendship, something breaking apart, the end of a day, night falling, perhaps even signifies death. It's a flat perspective though, heavily worked paint surface, as I said, which pushes the painting towards you, and it almost to the point where there's an element, or certainly the figures in the painting have been abstracted. There's this feeling that it balances between realism and abstraction, but contains some more profound meaning, but it's not clear what that meaning is. So what starts as a happy-go-lucky seaside painting, with a bit more time spent on it, turns into something a bit deeper. Let me change again to a very different artist. Henry Scott Tuke, Ruby Golden Malachite, which I think refers to a poem and to the colours used in the painting. This is 1902, 2 years before he'd been elected an associate of the Royal Academy, and he later became a full member of the Royal, an academician. And his work fell out of favour after World War I, and was virtually unknown until it was discovered by gay artists in the 1970s, and now he's quite a well-known artist. Now, generally, I said previously that men bathed naked and in rivers and by the sea, and that continued into the Edwardian period. And so naked youths were acceptable in a painting, in a classical context certainly, but also when bathing, because men did bathe naked. So they were times when it was acceptable to show them naked. And this was one of his successful paintings. And he was, I should also mention that it wasn't this, the reason I'm hesitating, let me show you the painting. This painting was seen by a well-known dealer, Carnegie. You might have heard of the Carnegie dealership, but he withdrew his support of the New English Art Club after seeing this painting, The Bathers, also by Tuke. So it wasn't an acceptable subject for everybody. But Tuke was also one of the leading marine artists in the country and painted a lot of marine paintings of ships at sea. And that was considered a manly occupation. And so reviewers had mixed feelings about Tuke. One described, just to give you a sort of a feel, what one used the description, its decorative beauty, which was a signal of effeminacy. But another praised the sailors and boys, which implied manliness. So people had, and also a single boy would be one thing, but a group is less threatening at this period because it moves from the homoerotic to the homosocial, which was acceptable because healthy young men was part of the, for example, the public school model of Thomas Arnold, who was headmaster at Rugby and introduced this idea of health and fitness and healthy young men. So we could read this painting in many ways. It's a celebration of athletic masculinity, healthy sport of swimming, representation perhaps of innocence and fun and purity of youth, unself-consciousness in natural setting, celebrating man as part of nature, a lost rural idyll perhaps, or a depiction of, and I think this was very relevant in 1902, the healthy sons of empire, because the health of the nation, the health of young men and women had deteriorated extremely rapidly from 1880 to 1900. This isn't very well known, but there's been some research done recently and articles published that within 2 generations, the healthy British male had deteriorated to such an extent that in 1900, 5 out of 10 young men volunteering to go to the second Boer War had to be rejected because they were so undernourished. They weren't starved, they'd been eating the wrong food, which is, there's a long story to tell about how that happened. But basically processed food was introduced in the 1880s and it became very popular because it was cheap and the whole health of the nation deteriorated. And you could argue it's still deteriorated. But it was in the front of everybody's, because of the Boer War and the rejection of young men, it was brought to everybody's attention. So healthy sons of empire was perhaps the way a lot of people would see this painting. Laura Knight again, she hired, because it was so difficult to find models willing to pose naked in Newlyn, she hired them and paid for them to travel down from London. And she wrote that she was very, this improved her art enormously. It increased her confidence in painting the human body, and it freed herself from the rigidity that had been imposed on her when she was at art college. She was only allowed to draw the nude from plaster sculptures. And so she needed to draw and paint the nude, and she did that in the open air. There were some complaints from locals, but there was one colonel painter who lived nearby who supported her and allowed her to his property, went down to the sea to work in his property. And this piece, the bathing pool, is almost certainly Lamorna, because the pool there has been identified. It's exposed at low tide, and it's the first painting she did of naked women on the cliffs, and it was shown at the Royal Academy. But the original painting she did, Daughters of the Sun, was destroyed, lost. She also painted a number of pictures of women, in fact, the same models, on cliff tops. And this is on the cliff, Cornwall. one of the women is sewing and the other's threading a needle, is what's going on here. They were professional models. In fact, one of them, Dolly Snell, who was an ex-Tiller girl, later married Laura Knight's husband, Harold's brother, Edgar, and became Mrs. Edgar Knight. This painting, the one on the left, on the cliff, sold at Sotheby's in 2009 for £645,000, which is the highest price. I believe it's still the highest price ever paid for a painting by Laura Knight. Right. We're now in the 1930s. Things are starting to change again. These are the wonderful travel posters that were produced in the 1930s and 40s. The one on the right is in the 1940s for a travel poster for British Rail promoting travel to Whitley Bay. And it shows a woman in a green bikini, which in fact had just been invented by a French fashion designer 2 years previously, delighted at her finding a starfish, the fun of the seaside. And the other two are well-known artists, illustrators, and producers of posters. Frank Newbold, born in Bradford, went to Camberwell School of Art, and Bruce Angrave, another illustrator and poster artist, son of a graphic designer, and produced posters for Great Western Railways, one of which sold fairly recently for £3,000 in New York. So they're one of the reasons I'm showing them is I think they're wonderful illustrations and works of art that are not often recognized as such. But let's go even further down that direction of travel to the forgotten postcard as an art form is in itself, the saucy postcard. It was in 1930s these started to become popular for the first time, and they featured a lot of stereotypes: the bespectacled young man, the henpecked husband, the fat vicar, the drunk, and so on. The saucier the better. At their peak, they were selling 16 million saucy postcards a year, and the biggest name, the one who sold more than anyone else, was the one who produced this, Donald McGill. It wasn't until he was 32 he gave up a secure job to become an artist, and he started producing saucy postcards, and they sold well, and he continued to do so until his death when he was 87. And in his lifetime, he sold over 350 million cards. I think, I'm just trying to think, I think by that measure, he must be the most successful artist of all time. However, there was another side to it. It seems surprising now that this innocent fun, that this one is, well, you can read it. Do you like Kipling? I don't know, you naughty boy. I've never been kippled. Sort of a fun phrase that predates the postcard and goes back to, I think about 1917 was the first time this joke was used. But this particular postcard became his most popular, and it alone sold 6 million copies, and according to the Guinness Book of Records was the most popular saucy postcard. But what I was going to say was they weren't found acceptable by everyone. We might regard them as innocent fun, but they were thought to undermine the moral fibre of the country, and in fact shops selling them were raided by the police and closed down, and McGill was subjected to a show trial in 1954 and sentenced to a huge fine. So it wasn't all the innocent fun and laughter we might think. It was treated as serious and unacceptable by some people, obviously not by everybody, otherwise you wouldn't have sold so many. Winifred Nicholson, a very different near abstract work by Nicholson, made during a holiday on the Northumberland, Alnmouth, this is Northumberland coast. She's probably better known for her flower paintings and landscapes. And this is one of her seascapes. She's reduced it to a few simpler areas of colour. It's very evocative. She actually used real sand on the painting, denoting the beach, and it's the paintings. Currently, last time I looked, it was on display at the Tate. She, just to mention the name Nicholson, she was born Roberts, but she married Ben Nicholson, the artist, who a few years later, I was going to say had an affair, but it was started to live with Hepworth, Barbara Hepworth. They had triplets, but he stayed with Winfred Nicholson. In some ways she was maintaining him. She came from a wealthy family. She was the granddaughter of the 9th Earl of Carlisle, and but he eventually, after Barbara Hepworth had triplets a few years later, he obtained a divorce and he married Barbara Hepworth, and they moved down to St. Ives just before the war, 1938. And eventually they divorced in 1951. I don't know whether you've seen this. This is Stanley Spencer, Southwold, another complex story behind this. I'm trying to avoid telling the life story of Stanley Spencer, but it was where he stayed with his brother in Southwold, and met Hilda Carline, who he married a few years later. He divorced Hilda a few years later. In fact, in this year, 1937, they divorced and married Patricia Preece. And he realized quite quickly that the marriage was a sham. Preece was a lesbian and continued to live with her partner, Dorothy Hepworth. As I said, it was quite a complicated story. Preece, incidentally, was highly regarded as an artist at the time, but we now know she actually signed and exhibited the work of her partner, Dorothy, as her own work. But anyway, Spencer, realizing the mistake, tried to re-establish relationships with Hilda Carline and tried to persuade her to return to Southwold. He wrote her letters almost every day on a second honeymoon, and she wouldn't. So he went there on his own, stayed in the same lodgings, and went by bus to Southwold every day, which is where he painted this picture. Some people interpret the breakers at the front, this wall at the front, as cutting him off from the pleasures of a seaside holiday, which he no longer could participate in because the woman he loved, he'd divorced and wouldn't see him again. Eventually, in fact, she agreed to a reunion, but that was coincided in 1950 with a diagnosis of breast cancer, and she died before they could be reunited. And Spencer continued to write her long letters. I mean, some of the letters are 100 pages long. And he wrote these long letters for the rest of his life, often mentioning the happy times they had in Southwold. Right, 1930s was the rise of the holiday camp. That's Billy Butlin down there. The founder of the holiday camps, first one in Skegness, doubled in size within a year. Second one was in Clacton. And he created them because as a kind of fantasy world, because he could see that people were having to live in cramped boarding houses. They weren't allowed to go back to the boarding house during the day, even if it was pouring with rain. And he wanted to create a fantasy world for the working man to escape to, luxurious but affordable. And that's exactly what he did. In 1938, there was an act passed by Parliament, the Holidays with Pay Act, which resulted in an explosion in tourism because for the first time, factories, employers were of all sizes were forced to give their workers a 1 week's holiday a year paid. And by 1939, there was something like 300 to 400 holiday camps in the UK, ranging in size up to 6,000 beds. During the war, they were used as army camps, and Butlin actually was clever. He persuaded the government to extend the range and pay for new camps at Filey, Ayr and Fwrtheli, and they became very popular after the war. In the 1970s, though, travel abroad, flights became cheaper and people started to go to Spain, and the popularity declined. Although you might have read recently, that is a few weeks ago, that Butlin's holiday resorts were sold back to their former owners for £300 million. So there's still a market, a big market for holiday camps. And just another view of a poster advertising holiday camps, described as the wonderful £50,000 holiday camp, meaning he was putting together that if you paid for the holiday, which initially was as low as 45 shillings a week, you got free golf, tennis, bowls, bathing, dancing, concert parties, boating, and so on, and 4 good meals a day, he said in the advertisements, cooked by experienced chefs. So let's move on, because this is 1940 and the Second World War has just started. I've taken one, well, there's a couple of paintings painted during the war. This is actually a war painting, Totis Mere, or Dead Sea, painted by Paul Nash, and he visited an aircraft dump at Cowley in Oxfordshire. And what struck him was that all of these broken up planes, this dump, looked to him like, the thing looked to me suddenly like a great inundating sea, the breakers rearing up and crashing on the plane, but nothing moves. It's not water or even ice, it's something static and dead. And that's what he's painted here. He was told that none of the planes should have the British roundel on, so they're all painted with as German planes, as British planes never crashed, as the message here. But he has created an unsettling atmosphere. It's the only sign of life is this solitary owl flying over the scene of death. But on another, maybe slightly jollier note, because there's Punch and Judy here and there's some swings here, but this is Lowry, Lawrence Stephen Lowry. The strange thing is, though, I think it's a bit tongue-in-cheek. It's painted in 1943, so the war's still on. Everyone is fully clothed. I can't see anybody wearing a bathing costume. Even those in the sea seem to be have their hats and coats on. Those brave enough to enter into the sea. It raises the question, actually, for me, of did people actually go to the seaside during the war? Well, it turns out, after some research, that it was frowned on by the government, but the government never passed the law. The government was worried that the roads and railways would be clogged by people travelling to the seaside and prevent military vehicles from travelling quickly down the roads and on the railways. So they produced posters and they encouraged people not to take holidays, and they invented something called Holidays at Home in 1942, which encouraged councils to run dances and sporting activities and allow camping in their parks everywhere in the country, other than the seaside, to encourage people to take their holidays at home. Well, people loved the fact that they had more forms of entertainment locally and they used them, but they still continued to go on holiday. And it was clear by this year, 1943, that although the local schemes were successful, people still needed to take a week's holiday, which they did. William Roberts, the Seaside, a few years later, 1966, a celebration of people enjoying themselves on the beach. William Roberts himself was a bit of a recluse, but he did spend his life painting and drawing ordinary people, and particularly people at leisure. He painted a lot of people, I don't know, playing musical instruments and playing snooker, skipping, seesaws, sunbathing, and so on. He came from a poor family, but he actually won a scholarship to the Slade. He served on the Western Front, became a war artist, and after the war, a talented portrait painter. He was very prolific, but when he died, he didn't leave a will. All of his paintings went to his son, but his son didn't leave a will, and 475 of his paintings are now held by the Tate in lieu of, well, some of them are actually in lieu of inheritance tax, but the remainder the Tate is holding until 2025. And if no one claims them, what will probably happen is that the government, rather than selling them, will allow the Tate to keep them. Let's hope so. Another artist who isn't held by the Tate is Beryl Cook, but I thought I would show her. She was born in Surrey. She moved to Plymouth, where she opened a boarding house and started to paint as a hobby. But she would hang the paintings in the boarding house and people would buy them and encourage her to exhibit them, which she did starting in 1975, this year, Beach at Loo. And to her surprise, they all sold like hotcakes. So she continued to paint them because her paintings were loved by the public and were sold at up to £40,000. But major art galleries would not show her work. And the Tate doesn't own a single Beryl Cook. Her work has been described by an art critic in The Guardian, as it happens, as trite, patronizing, and reduces human life to a repetitive variety act. That's not my view. I think they're fun. They make me laugh. Although crowded beaches don't make me laugh. This is, I took this short video when I walked 5 miles along the coast to Loo to go onto the beach. But when I stopped at this point, and when I saw how crowded the beach was, and it was extremely loud as well, the sound of the beach, you could hear from here, I must admit I turned around and went back again. I don't like crowded beaches, but Beryl Cook obviously makes a living from them. Right, 2 more to go. This is Martin Parr, The Last Resort. It's a photograph. It's one of 40 photographs he took of New Brighton, which is a beach suburb of Liverpool. He uses a medium format camera, so quite a high resolution camera, and he uses a daylight flash. He processes them to produce this saturated color. Now, when he first showed this in the 1980s, he was seen as an indictment of the economic policies of Margaret Thatcher. And he was seen to be showing an area of economic deprivation. But more recently, in a biography that was written, and some of the things that Martin Parr has said, I don't think that was his intention. he loves the eccentric. He loves everyday life. He always manages to find quirky views of everyday life. And this woman here with the freckled back is sunbathing, face down on a white towel. She's turned away from her. Her young daughter is crouching beside her. She's playing with a red bucket, and there are other buckets around. I love the man just walking by holding something, a plastic bag with his belongings in. It's an ordinary scene. It's made, I don't know about undermined, and I'm not sure it's comical, but it's the enormous piece of haulage machinery, possibly a crane behind her, and these huge tank-like wheels loom over the reclining figure. Maybe it's comical, maybe though it suggests a futuristic wasteland, like the science fiction films of the 1980s when he took this photograph. Apocalyptic dread, I don't know, but maybe he's satirizing all of that. It's not aggressive, but on the other hand, it's not really benign. It's a picture, it's taken as if it was a snapshot, although I'm sure it was carefully composed. And then finally, Peter Doig, Bather. I'm ending with the Scottish artist Peter Doig as one of his most recent works. I tried to find a recent work of fine art, and the most recent I could find was this series 2020. Peter Doig, of course, has become one of the most celebrated living figurative artists. And here he's reimagining this photograph. It's a publicity photograph of Robert Mitchum in the early 1940s. So a much older photograph. And it's one of a number of paintings of the same subject. I don't know how many he produced. I think it was about 20 different that I've seen. They're all slightly different. In this one, he has painted a naked woman in the background, but it's as if it's taken from or cut out from a magazine of the 1950s. You wonder whether there's meant to be a relationship between Robert Mitchum and the woman, or is she just sunning herself on the beach? She's holding her head in her hands. Is she adjusting her hair, or is she in anguish? Is there some problem here? We'll never know. It's ambiguous in its meaning. His work, of course, has set records at auctions. It's in 2007, his work White Canoe sold for over $11 million, which set a record at the time. And another work sold about the same time for $12 million in London. He's highly regarded by the critics. And let me read a quote from Jonathan Jones, in fact, the critic who made that comment about Beryl Cook. He got a very different view of Peter Doig. Amid all the nonsense, imposters, rhetorical bullshit and sheer trash that pass for art in the 21st century, Doig is a jewel of genuine imagination, sincere work and humble creativity. Thank you. That concludes my brief overview of 250 years of British seaside art, represented by some well-known and perhaps less well-known works of art. Thank you for watching.